Should I start now? I'm sorry.
No, just as soon as I share the flyer, just 10 more seconds.
Okay, can you please let me know when I should start?
The flyer will show on the screen.
Okay.
You can start, Riham.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Riham Mokbil. I have more than 9 years experience in research, journalism, and public relations, and I have a special focus on CSR and sustainable development in Egypt. I am so happy to be here among all of you today. Welcome to this webinar from the GC webinar series, Aftermath of the COVID-19, the new social impact ecosystem. Today, we are honored to have with us Professor Simon Senner, and the title of this webinar today will going to be to business diplomacy. And just a brief and a quick introduction to the topic. Successful operations abroad depend on a company's commercial strength, financial resources, competitive products, and its ability to engage and interact with non-business counterparts, such as non-governmental organizations, international organizations, tribal leaders, and academics. It also depends on its ability to look for common interests, prevention of conflicts, to generate positive reputational capital for the companies and positive social capital for non-business stakeholders, which could achieve win-win situations. Then business diplomacy draws competencies from traditional diplomacy and international management, and it appeared first in management journals in early 2000s. And now I introduce Professor Simon, just quick brief. He is a professor at Basel University, Economics Department, and he has taught at Sciences Po Paris for public policy and Lomberg University for environmental negotiations. His research projects focus on trade, international relations, organization and management, and socioeconomic development. He serves as an officer in professional organizations such as the Academy of Management and is member of International Association of Applied Psychology. He is also an expert for international organizations such as World Trade Organization, UNICEF, UNDP, and etc. Now I will give him the floor for 30 minutes, and I'm quite sure this will gonna be very fruitful and insightful presentation. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Rehan, for introducing me, for your kind words. And I will now do my best to upload the slides, and I will start right away. Do you see it?
Yeah, I see it.
All right. Okay, so welcome to everybody. I'm going to talk about a topic that maybe some of you are already a bit familiar with. For others, it will be new. Let me start by going a bit into history. What are the precursors of business diplomats? Well, it's not a new, in that sense, a new term. Even in the Middle Ages or even before, people traveled, conducted business and trade, and also at the same time did what I would now today call business diplomacy. You have here, for instance, going back to the early Middle Ages, you have Marco Polo who traveled to China. You have certainly heard about his stories on land, by sea, and his return, where on one hand, he, of course, discovered new land, but also conducted business and also represented the Republic of Venice. You've had, on the other hand, a gentleman from China, Admiral Zhang He, who in 1371 to 1433, he traveled several times with enormously big ships from China all the way to the Persian Gulf and even all the way over to to Africa. These were gigantic ships, just as an example, compared to Columbus. His ship Santa Maria was 26-meter long. His ships were 120 meters long and several levels high. But I'm mentioning this because today we have all these discussions about China and East and West and the new Silk Road. Well, already at that time, people traveled, and they were travelers and also traders, as well as adding other aspects to their travels. And I will say much further more about it. But just as an example about China and Europe, we have this one of the several Italian Jesuits who traveled to China to be a teacher, astronomer, and Matteo Ricci is a famous example of somebody who actually became very Chinese in the way he dressed, the way of course, he spoke fluently Chinese, and then at the same time, he remained a Catholic priest, but it was a great pleasure to be able to live and teach in China. So we've had several companies. I'm sure you might have heard about, for instance, the East Asia companies from the UK, from Denmark, from Sweden, from France. You also had missions, the Basel missions, where I come from, where people traveled on one hand to do trade, but also to do beneficiary activities and acted at the same time as a honorary consular, representing, for instance, regarding Basel, the city of Basel and Switzerland. So it was a mixture of different things these people would conduct. And in that sense, for me, they were already business diplomats way before we started to coin this notion, this word. Well, I wanted to find out about business diplomacy when I was in New York. I was teaching there, also did my PhD in New York. And while being in New York, I also participated in a survey that the United Nations Institute for Training and Research conducted in New York City. They wanted to know what are the needs for training of the diplomats assigned to the United Nations. And as number two of the needs at the top, a very high priority was indications that they would like to get more training in negotiations. And so we got that job, and I went on with a colleague to talk to the different attachés in New York from different countries to find out more what are they doing and what are their specific backgrounds. What I found out was a lot of them were sometimes political diplomats and sometimes trade diplomats, and they would be moving back and forth, which baffled me. So I wanted to compare what the different countries, what their notions were in regards to diplomacy. And there were rules at that time which indicated, for instance, for Germany, West Germany, it was not the correct thing to do to move from being a diplomat from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to move over to business, or even back to being an official representative, which was, and for France, on the other hand, is the famous notion of the parachutage, where people at the top of a ministry, for instance, or of the government, would land or would go over to a big public enterprise, and in that sense join the business community. Austria also had separate lines. All what was concerning business was conducted by commercial diplomats, but there were no back and forth with the other colleagues from the political side of diplomacy. So several countries I realized had different notions and different rules. And I wanted at the end to find out more in detail what's the situation in countries where diplomats would also join businesses. What were they doing, and what was their notion of the business that they were involved in? So I did the first initial research. It was 7 American big multinational companies which had gave me access to find out what kind of business diplomacy were they doing and who was responsible for business diplomacy. So one thing that I found, I'm just summarizing some of the main findings. There were, in regards to business diplomacy, what was very much on their mind was relations with the national American NGOs and international NGOs, how to best find a way to be in good relations with them, and also, of course, how to avoid confrontations or difficulties with some of the more well-known NGOs. I also found out that 57% of the respondents reported that their company systematically analyzed the political, social, and environmental developments in the key regions where they were active in and the countries where they had subsidiaries. They needed to scan and find out what's happening. Also, if you see here, the first, in terms of importance, what they signaled to me, what was very important for them was to be able to understand the interplay between economics, politics, and culture in the countries where they had a subsidiary. And also linked to that, what the decision-making process, what it consisted of in these other countries where they were conducting business. And they had different people whose responsibility was to focus on these two topics. Why? Because I was told about 47% of the people who responded was that for them, it was very important to safeguard a good reputation. So to avoid losing the reputation or ending up in the press or having difficulties, it felt for them it was very important to have a business diplomat, somebody who would scan and look and prevent whatever conflict that might occur, which will put the company into difficulties. 5 years later, I did a second study, this time together with my colleague, Dr. Li Jiayu. We wanted to find out what these big Swiss transnational companies were doing in regards to business diplomacy. It was a difficult research project because we noticed the transnational companies, and that includes the Swiss multinational companies, were very careful about this topic and didn't want to be too much transparent and revealing too many of the secrets, could say, how they conduct business diplomacy. We had these companies who ended up participating, giving access to them: Hoffmann La Roche, Novartis, Syngenta, Nestle. As you know, these are gigantic, big companies. As you could just see here in terms of employees, Hoffmann La Roche, 65,000 people worldwide, Novartis, 81,000, and Nestle even 253,000 people, generating enormous sales. So big transnational companies, but also in need of being careful and in need to avoid running into conflicts. But the trust issue was very, very important. It took a long time to get access and to be able to do the semi-structured interviews and to hear from them how they tackled this topic of business diplomacy. I also found out that for these 4 big Swiss transnational companies, the following people were responsible for it. You had people who were previously senior government officials who then joined the company, or former diplomats, and we had also public relations consultants. It's here, the percentage is also indicates that some held 2 jobs at the same time. So it wasn't that they just only did or were responsible of business diplomacy. But overall, you could see a good number of them were former diplomats or former government officials. Now, when we use the term, and I introduced the term business diplomacy 22 years ago, and it's become now part of management studies. But at that time, I also needed to ask myself, can I use the term diplomacy and combine it with business? So I did a bit of research to find out what is the diplomacy all about, and just a few words about this. First of all, when it comes to traditional diplomacy, of course, there are rules to conducting diplomacy, best described in the treaty, the signed 1961, the Vienna Convention, which defines clearly in detail what ambassadors should do, how they're protected when they're on mission or assignment. The traditional diplomacy is well defined. And at the same time, over the last 30 to 40 years, there has been a transformation of this term and also of the profession. Sir Harold Nicolson, a famous British diplomat, wrote 1939 what diplomacy is all about. He said, so management of international relations by negotiations, and it's the method by which these relations are adjusted and managed by ambassadors and envoys. Later on, U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz already came up with a different notion of diplomacy. He said the raw material of diplomacy is information. To get it, assess it, and to put it into the system. System, he means international relations system, for the benefits and puzzlement of others. Then we had further developments in terms of definitions by Gordon Smith. It's the art of advancing national interests through the sustained exchange of information among governments, nations, and other groups. Its purpose is to change attitudes and behavior as a way of reaching agreements and solving problems. And finally, I quote a colleague from the Klingendahl Institute in the Netherlands, Jan Melissen, who said, diplomacy is defined as the mechanism of representation, communication, and negotiation through which states and other international actors conduct their business. So you see, from the beginning, from Nicholson all the way up now to 1999, it's become a more broader concept. And it includes, in that sense, also notions of non-state actors who are engaged in relations with state actors. So basically, new genres of diplomats have emerged. And I would like to basically give you here an overview. You see a group on the left of a business diplomat, corporate diplomat. That's non-state actors representing business. A corporate diplomat is taking care in a large multinational company of the relations between headquarters and the different subsidiaries. A business diplomat, on the other hand, is responsible for relations to the environment, to non-business partners, and that includes civil society, and I will say more about it as we go further with my presentation. On the right side, you have official government representatives. For instance, economic diplomats. It could be the Ministry of Economic Affairs, the commercial diplomat representing ministries of trade or commerce. And at the bottom, you see another grouping of non-state actors. These are the international NGOs, civil society, and some of them are almost, you could say, like a transnational company. They're worldwide, like WWF, Oxfam. They're quite powerful civil society organizations who engage with business as well as with government, to find this here symbolized with the gray area or gray zone, to find common ground based on which, for instance, an investment or an infrastructure investment can be conducted. Now, that was the first publication when we looked at international economic diplomacy and later on business diplomacy. I would like to now say a few more words about business diplomacy. So it's about managing relationships with non-business stakeholders, not just continuous buying, selling, being engaged with other business partners, but this is something other than business to business. It's the business with non-business stakeholders. We have, and I said that already before, but here look at business diplomacy that could be, for instance, relations to a labor union, to tribal leaders, political parties, and I will say more about that shortly. So in order to promote an enterprise's interest, an enterprise may use a number of different strategies. Business, traditional business, quality of the product they have to sell, the price, merger or acquisitions to grow if they want, or hostile takeovers, cartels, outsourcing, and so on. These are traditional business strategy. But to this now I add business diplomacy, relations with non-business partners. I already mentioned this before. Let me move forward. So at the international level, a business diplomat representing a large company would also be very much following very closely what is being discussed, negotiated, agreed, for instance, at the World Trade Organization or at UNCTAD or at other international organizations where agreements maybe are being reached that could have consequences for business. At the national level, a business diplomat would follow closely new laws that are being negotiated in Parliament or new regulations that a government is deciding to put forward to the business community. But at the bottom, particularly, this is business diplomacy also, relations to civil society, consumer groups, tribal leaders, and you will see from the two case examples I will give shortly what this means. So some best learning can be obtained when following more closely failed business diplomacy. Let me start with one concerning a Swiss company that I'm sure you know. It's called Nestlé. Nestlé faced a very difficult period in regards to the baby milk formula. It was the proposal that Nestlé put out to mothers in developing countries that they could, in that sense, move from breastfeeding to baby milk formula to offer substitute food for their babies. What they did not include, and they did not do the sufficient research, is that in many of the developing countries, the water is poisonous. It cannot be mixed with powdered milk and to create a baby milk formula, because the children, many of them fell ill, some even died. And when this became public, of course, accusations came quickly towards Nestlé that they should do something about it. However, and that was the mistake, they didn't think it through, they didn't have a business diplomat to help them. They refused to engage in a discussion about whether or not baby formula in countries with improper or impure water is a bad formula and shouldn't be offered. So civil society groups organized themselves, and out of that organization came enormous bad press, boycott of Nestlé's product. They took their complaint to the World Health Organization, to UNICEF, and at the end, with the new codes that were negotiated and came about at WHO, Nestle had to figure out a way to rethink what to do about breast milk formula. It wasn't just Nestle. There were other companies like Nestle who tried to sell baby food formulas. And the solution came when there was an agreement that Nestle should not anymore advertise its baby milk formula without clearly indicating the conditions that should be met or should exist in the country where mothers would use the formula instead of breastfeeding their babies. But the damage was considerable. You have here examples of bad press about Nestle, about the food that Nestle was accused of poisoning people. You had also a statement here which was not true, but they claimed that the Nestle CEO said all water is not a human right. It should be privatized and has a market value. Hence, what's the problem about water? That's not a public good. So basically, when it got to be a full boycott of Nestle's products and accusations and very, very tough meetings at the press or on television, Nestle started to realize it had to do more than simply say it's not our responsibilities if mothers use our powder and forget to check on the quality of water. If you go Google and just check about baby formula and Nestle, you see thousands of previous statements that were made. So the reputational capital for Nestle got damaged. So we have another one example, and that's Shell. Shell, what happened to Shell in Nigeria? Shell was there before independence. It was one of the major companies. When independence came about for Nigeria, they kept going with their production, and particularly production being the look for oil and gas. And they did that in an area in the southern part of Nigeria, the so-called where the Ogoni people live. That was also the area where 20 years before the Biafra War happened. But what the problem that came about here for Shell was mostly the problem that the Ogoni people had to suffer through, because the search for oil and the processing of oil, it led to a lot of oil spills, which were not attended. And on top of it also, there was a coup, and the military government, they just didn't care about the Ogoni people who lived in the area that was suffering from oil spills. So they rebelled, and then the leaders of the Ogoni people were sentenced and killed, which led to enormous upheavals. And of course, some of their anger was aimed at Shell, because Shell was seen as producing not only oil, but damaging the environment, and also produce money for the military regime, which was oppressing them. It was a major, major upheaval. And this lasted for years. You had local and international NGOs which aimed at Shell and took Shell to court, first in New York, then in London. It went on for a long time. It became public, like with the baby formula for Nestle. It's thousands of, when you Google, of reports that you could find. And at the end, it was taken even to the Dutch court. And at the Dutch court, Shell was just recently was asked to pay up for the damage it caused in terms of oil spills in the Ogoni area of Nigeria. That's a 30-year process of being also in the press. So the reputational damage for Shell was tremendous, and still it's a carryover into how people perceive Shell. So in other words, the moral of the story is to say a good business diplomat or business diplomacy function would also look at relations to the tribal people, the environment, the people who use their products, what could go wrong and what should be done other than just simply do as the saying goes by good old Friedman, business is to be, the business of business is business, and not to care about the environment within which a company is embedded. Now, there are carrots and sticks when it comes to good behavior of companies. So I'm basically just saying it is more sensible for companies, especially large companies, to proactively look at what does the company's activities do or create for their clients and for the environments within which the company is operating. There is, on the other hand, also the stick. There is a growing movement by governments to agree on so-called responsible business conduct rules or criteria. You have here at the top the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. That's now 10 years old, well known, was agreed at the United Nations and is being implemented at government level. You also have corporate social responsibility. That's voluntary. It's things that companies do to reach out to their environment. You have the OECD Responsible Business Conduct, and that's now soft law. I say a few words later on about it. These are, and the Global Compact and the Economic, Social, and Governance Investment Rules. These are basically the environment is starting to be framed in a good sense. I mean, there are rules that are being agreed upon by governments and increasingly also by business who see value in conducting business in a responsible manner. For instance, when it comes to the OECD guidelines, you could see here the cases that have been brought to government's attention. It's called the national contact points, where the cases were debated, and the company as well as the claimants, is mostly labor unions or civil society organizations, that took them to, not to court, but to the mediation process within a government. And you see 40% ended up with an agreement. And even more importantly, in 2019, of all these cases that were mediated by the governments and were discussed between government and NGOs, 47% of the companies who had to go through a mediation also changed their policies because they realized that they had to adjust to a more responsible business conduct in order to avoid future problems. Even now, the most recent, it's very much worth to take note of this. The 5th May 2021, this year, there was a district court in The Hague which ruled that Shell, now that's nothing to do this in this way, in this sense about Nigeria or the previous Ogoni case, but Shell has to reduce its CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to their CO2 emissions in 2019. This was brought about by a group of NGOs who took Shell to court in the Netherlands, and the court decided in favor of the NGOs, and Shell had to accept to change its policies and also to be less invested in coal. You have another case, the famous international bank ING. Also, a decision was taken in 2019 a group of NGOs which brought the bank also to court because of their lack of implementation of the Paris Agreement, which is of course about environmental climate change, to prevent climate change. They agreed to reduce their thermal coal exposure and to be close to zero by 2025 in terms of their carbon carbon outputs, and to refrain from financing new coal-fired power plants. This is an enormous decision, which led to a bit of like a little bit of an earthquake around the business community, and particularly concerning the energy producing companies. There's more and more pressure building up to get companies of a certain size to be more responsible business oriented. Now, how to do this differently? Going to court or being asked to go to court, of course, that's can be part of business, but it would be much better and to listen to a business diplomat who, for instance, following the example of the coal table in Japan, produces suggestions as to what companies could do voluntarily by doing more in regards to contributing to the sustainable development goals. And most companies have staff, have something to do about decent work, well-being, about the place where they work. All these SDGs are directly part of any business. But the idea here is to look at this picture that the coal roundtable produced, to look at the production process, whatever, for instance, here it's food, but it could be any other product, from the beginning of buying resources, and then producing the product that is sold at the end, all the way from beginning to the end. There are different steps of manufacturing, and each step has the opportunity and the possibility for a company, if they're wise and adding business diplomacy to their business, to look for meaningful engagement with also the environment that could help them in terms of producing their products in a more sustainable manner. And how to do this would also be, for instance, to look at the so-called major groups. These are all NGOs, non-state actors, who have been given the space at the United Nations to partake in negotiations. Their role is very important. And, you know, the idea will be for businesses to relate to the women's group, to find out how could they better, you heard 2 days ago, I think there was the presentation by my colleague, Mr. Deva, Soraya Deva, about the gender-based new technologies and how, without knowing, we could continue with discriminating against women. Now, the women's group is there to help, of course, to defend the rights of women. But a smart company with a good business diplomacy unit will be in contact with the farmers, the local authorities, the women, the workers, the trade unions, to find ways to cooperate. And the other word here is to co-create with them, to find solutions that are beneficial for the company, but also beneficial for the environment. And you see, a lot of this is not business as usual. So my closing comment is just simply to say business diplomacy already exists. It's done, but it's less known And I think now that we have an established new field in management and international business, it would be worth it to consider how, if you are representing a company, how could you take on board a more sustainable view, which will include a business diplomacy perspective, also to avoid that a company ends up in court or ends up being finger pointed, like it happened to Nestle or to Shell, which later on ends up being a terrible loss in terms of reputational capital. But that's just, the concern about doing the wrong things. It's better to do the right things and to reach out, and in that sense, to have business diplomacy as part of the business of the company. I'm stopping here, and I just wanted to say there is lots of now research that has been done. Lija and I have been called the grandparents of this concept because we created it and been around, but others have done wonderful research, published. You have one at the bottom, Hoob Rule and his colleagues. So the field exists, and I hope others will take on the same task as we did to find out and to advise companies how they could use business diplomacy for their own good, but also for the benefit of their environment and of their communities that are part of their life. I'm ending here, and I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you, Professor. Very interesting topic. Actually, SDGs is on fire. I mean, it's at the core of every country's agenda. Especially, we are about to reach 2030 and its agenda and every country's vision for 2030. Thank you again. And I have just a few questions for you, and then I will give the chance for audience to ask you. I'm wondering, what are the skills that every business diplomat should have to be employed for multinational companies or for any companies to present their interests with government, with non-governmental organizations, with every and each player to at the end achieve the target? What knowledge they should have? What are the skills and practices? And how can you differentiate the context? I mean, here the context of developed countries and the context of developing countries. Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, all right. Well, it's a very good question. Actually, in some of our publications, we defined this in detail, and we also compared business schools from diplomatic academies. And we found that neither of the two were teaching courses about business diplomacy. So there is a gap in terms of the knowledge and skills. And it's a mixture of some basic diplomatic skills, as I tried to present that before briefly, the ability to look for common interests, to not only in that sense sell whatever you have, try to make as much profit as you can, and then move on to some other market. The skill will be to still be a business person, and for sure to do your necessary business, to stay in business, you have to also make a profit, but to do it in a way that is more taking into account or be more inclusive with the partners, especially with the non-business partners. So it takes some knowledge about how to talk to non-business partners. There's a skill about, saying hello to people and to be engaged with people that normally a businessman or a businesswoman is not spending much time with. They're doing business with other business people. But it would include also, in that sense, knowing the land where the subsidiary is based, the culture, how are decisions made, how to be in that sense, appropriate. A part of that, of course, is taught at management schools in terms of cultural difference. But here it's a mix of being able to engage, to be with communities, not just to study how, you know, the French do whatever they do, or the Americans do whatever they do. That's oftentimes, of course, useful knowledge, but it's not the practice of conducting negotiations and business with people from other countries and other domains. So that's just as an first initial response to your excellent question. And I hope, of course, that the American University in Cairo will offer soon a course on business diplomacy. Are you muted?
Sorry. I will give the floor now for the audience. If they have any questions, you can raise your voice or write on the public chat. Actually, we have here a question from Vanit Sharma, if I correct it right. She is asking about how new diplomats in corporates like shareholders, investors can work and achieve fairness without the influence of the government. I don't know if I understand right or wrong. And give rise to inequality, yes, among employees, deprived classes, and the trust with government.
Yes.
Don't fully understand the question.
No. In case of there's yes, Raymond. Yes, in fact, I wanted to clarify on that point. Yes. So it was a wonderful presentation. So in fact, and it magnificent with magnificent insights. But my basic question was that that as far as the the new business diplomats are concerned, there are a lot of now new business models. For example, lobbies are coming up, business lobbies, and a lot of investors are coming up, which are of financial nature, PE firms, etc. And they are giving rise to what you call rent seeking model. So previously it used to be businesses used to be on trade basis. Now today they are rent seeking and much more profit seeking, which is giving rise to the race to the bottom. On the one hand, Microsoft and Apple are reaching 2 trillion market cap. On the other hand, there are labor etc. are being massively exploited. So how do you deal with such type of scenario, where the rent seeking behavior is leading to what you call a SoftBank, a model like SoftBank, which basically fund these innovation startups like Uber, etc., Airbnb, which look very good on paper, but in the end they bring disruption, they create a lot of unemployment, etc., in the emerging markets, just for for the rise of share capital, etc. And in fact, which basically lead to what you call excessive profit seeking behavior. So basically it can lead to what you call in future to a lot of what you call disenchantment, a lot of distrust in the system, which would be a challenge for governments, etc., for the entire society, because it will bring a lot of inequality. So how do you how do you deconstruct that narrative?
Okay, thank you. Well, your question actually is very broad. It includes beyond business diplomacy, includes the question about fairness. You have profit maximization, and you mentioned profit seeking, rent seeking, and what can be done about that. I think that's at a larger context. It's a question also about laws, about the counterweight to business would be also civil society and government. That in itself is a very important discussion, which we're holding right now in the context also of the SDGs. But to go back to the company themselves, you have a struggle and an enormous challenge for the business diplomat to talk to the line managers. Because in many of the bigger companies, line managers are assessed by their performance. And if it's a traditional company, the performance means how much profit have they contributed to the company's profit overall. Now, that's a very different orientation than what the business diplomat would do or tries to suggest. He doesn't suggest no more profits, because that would be the end of the company, but to have a more measured, a more inclusive form of doing business, which could also include some additional costs to take into account the needs of, for instance, consumers that use their products, for the environment, which has to live with maybe the effluent of water that has been used for the production of a company's goods. You see, that in itself can be seen by traditional line managers as just costs, but it's more than costs, because it generates not only at the worst case illness in the community if it's bad effluent water that's being let go into the river. It's just simply, again, the image with today's NGO and the media, if they can show that a company is ruthlessly only pursuing rent-seeking, profit maximization, but generates a lot of pain and difficulties to the environment, this doesn't sell well anymore today. So it would be almost rationally, logically, it would make sense for businesses to now reassess how they produce the goods that are being produced and how do they sell them to their customers.
Thank you.
I see a hand up by Professor Avni.
Sorry, back to questions. We have a question from Tarek, Matkour, and John Messenger.
Okay.
They are about the role of multinational companies, and or they have positive impacts on societies, or they have negative, that they spread rumors to people, especially in developing countries.
Is that a question whether overall multinational companies only are bad for society? Is it meant that way? I don't quite get the question fully. If that's the question that was put to me,
I give them the chance to ask their questions.
Okay.
Tore and John, can you raise your voice if you want to ask Professor directly? Hello, do you hear me? Tore or John?
Reham, do you have it written?
Okay, you finally unmuted me. This is John McIntyre in Atlanta, Georgia. Great to see you, Raymond. Excellent
Hello,
presentation as usual. I have two questions for you, if I may be so bold as to wrap them together. Yes, in your view, are you optimistic about multinational enterprises in the implementation of some select number of UN SDGs? And then the second related question is the 2021 UN Sustainable Development Report is about to be released. It has in fact been released, with Jeffrey Sachs giving a talk a few days ago.
Right.
And it appears that year 2020 saw a decrease in performance metrics in most of the UN SDGs. So my question to you, and it's a tough one, what's your expectation for 2021, the year we're currently living through? So I really have two questions, and I realize they are broad, but I'm sure you can sort of answer them through the prism of business diplomacy.
Thank you very much, John. I know I've seen the report by Jeffrey Sachs's Institute, and we know because, of course, COVID related, there has been a downturn in the economy, which had also consequences for society at large. That is known, that's clear. The question is just, when we go about, hopefully soon, rebuilding, going back to, let's say, more or less normal business, the issue there is, and that's what we mostly right now debate, not to go back to as it was, even though there is, of course, enormous pressure. People want to again catch up with all the time they lost, or the losses they made from a business point of view. But the idea will be to go forward, to build a better future, a more meaningful, sustainable future, and not just to replicate what was before, because most people agree that what was before COVID was not the best of all sustainable economy that we had. Now, optimistic or not, I am optimistic in the sense that what I mentioned before, the different emerging codes of conduct, OECD, United Nations, Global Compact, I think this is taking shape, and it's becoming not just only a threat, it can be just a threat. And I gave you examples of companies who lost at court, but it should also help. Well, if it's just voluntary, we know voluntary is a high risk, because one CEO from Danone, for instance, the French company, was accused by some of the traditional freedman type of shareholders who said, you don't do any corporate social responsibility, that's just costs, and that's not your job. So he lost actually his CEO position. I think this will be less the case in the future, because these norms, including investment, the ESG, more and more companies also state positively they see value in doing this. It's not just lip service. Of course, you can have greenwashing, blue washing, SDG washing, companies who pretend they care about it, but in fact they don't. I think they're slowly becoming the minority. There is, from my point of view, there is a sense of emergency we all face. The climate change discussions, as well as social conditions we're in. There's a bit more positive developments. I might be wrong, and we should talk about this again in a year's time. But I think the impact of COVID also got a few people to reconsider what is really or should be priority.
We have a question now from Dr. Ali. Hi, Dr. Ali.
Hi, Raymond. Thank you for a very insightful presentation. It's a mix of questions, comments. It's interesting that you've mentioned the UN Global Compact. And in the first article, they tell you that companies cannot be complicit in human rights violation. Now, the interesting thing is that when you look at human rights violation in general, any violation, even environmental, it never happens within the company. It always happens in second or third tier. And it sometimes happens also like by agency. They do it through a trader, a wholesaler, a big other corporation that does things. It's very hidden, and it's very hard to find it most of the time. This is my first question. The second one is, when you talk about things in international relations, it's not an issue of what is legal. When you talk about right, it's about what is proper, and it most often is about perception. And I think you've alluded to that. It has to do with culture. It has to do with how the locals are perceiving what you're doing, which is sometimes it takes lots of tacit knowledge. It takes lots of subtle humility to sort of understand it. So anyway, those are my two comments, my two questions.
Thank you. The first one, the OECD guidelines have been extended, and it includes for companies domiciled in one of the 50 countries that have signed up to the OECD guidelines. They are also responsible for their supply chain. So it's beyond just, you know, saying at home, I'm a good guy. I follow the rules, and the rest, it's not my business. The extension of including the supply chains has changed a bit the situation for businesses. And it's also, I must say, it is difficult to hold suppliers responsible for human rights violations, as an example. But it's not just, I forgot to emphasize this, the UN code, general principles is business and human rights. That's clear. The OECD guidelines is also one of them. It's a chapter is about human rights, but you have several others, such as tax fraud, such as environmental pollution, corruption. These are all, it's called chapters of OECD, and increasingly civil society and labor unions and others are going to their governments, to their national contact point, when they see and they can demonstrate that a company has not observed or has trespassed over these different chapters. So it's becoming more global. It's encompassing more than, of course, inclusive labor and human rights, but other aspects of business, which for me is quite interesting. It leads to a more comprehensive new definition of what a good company is all about. It's legal, true. It's partially, of course, it's not just, it cannot be only based on legal considerations. There is law and there are courts. And I gave you some examples of how big companies have lost recently in court. So there is an increasing pressure, I call it simply the sticks, to remind companies they have to comply with some very basic but clear responsible business conduct. But ideally, I would hope they should go beyond. Otherwise, it's just simply another legal game, and they can add another 100 lawyers to their company to defend the company in court. That would be, for me, a waste of energy, time, and resources. It would be much more sensible to have a business diplomacy orientation, which is proactive to avoid problems, future problems, and inclusive in the sense of already trying to look for ways to include others in the production of goods and services of a company. In other words, to share more rather than to ignore and only use them.
I have a question from Tariq Matkour. Tariq. Hello, do you hear me, Tariq?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Hello, hello, Dr. Raymond.
Hello.
I have actually two questions. The first question, do people like spread rumors, or actually do companies like agree with the people to spread these rumors? This is the first question.
Rumors, you mean to slander or just yeah, okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, the second one?
The second question is, does SMEs have to have, you know, the CSR certificates, or do big companies such as Nestle, etc., only have to have the CSR certificate?
Okay. CSR is voluntary. So oftentimes it depends what the CEO or whoever is in charge of a company considers good to do. And oftentimes when the CEO changes, what has been started by his predecessor might not be continued. So it's a bit, in that sense, a risky undertaking to only focus on corporate social responsibility. It will be more sensible for SMEs and for larger companies to take into account what these new codes are all about, including investors. Every company needs to borrow money for its operations, to go and get a bank to lend money, right? Now, you see, if a company such as was the case with Shell in Nigeria is in the press, is seen as some company that will have to go to court because the problems they created will cost money in terms of court and might also reduce the trust shareholders have in the company. Hence, the shareholder price comes down, and the bank, considering such a company as a risk, will increase its interest rates. So the borrowing will become more costly. There are very clear, straightforward business considerations which say it does not make sense to engage in old style business as usual. One has to rethink what a company can do. And of course, your first question, spreading rumors, you know about the disinformation. It's now unfortunately very widespread. Fake news, different groups attack each other through rumors, but that's part of where we're at. You have to figure out a way how to defend yourself as an individual, but also as a company against being slandered or being put into a bad light. However, like to add to this, if you had been Nestle and slandering happened, to some extent they really mischaracterized what the head of Nestle said. Some of it was just simply straightforward lies. They took it out of context. But if the company does not engage with those who are feeling very strongly that the company has been at fault, if the company just simply stays quiet, it is also easily be seen that they probably are guilty of something, and that's why they don't talk. So we have to also consider a proactive public relations and communication strategy rather than to try to hide, because that in itself today you can't last for a long time if you just refuse to respond and to defend yourself.
Thank you, Professor. I conclude now. Thank you for your very insightful webinar and a great discussion. Thank you all for participating in this webinar, and look forward to seeing all next Monday, June 28th at 7 p.m. with Dean Han, Director of Research Global. Sorry.
You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, sorry, something happened.
Sure.
With Dean Han, Director of Research, Global Impact Investment Network, who will talk about the frontiers of impact performance that provides to enable investors effectiveness, and efficiency. Thank you all again. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you, Raymond.
My pleasure.
Thank you. It's been really
Thank you,
great.
Dr. Ali, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Riham. It's my pleasure.
Ali, can you stay on a little bit longer?
Yes, I can.
Okay, sure. I think people are slowly leaving.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
But they're still there.